Maria Chen stood at the edge of the community center's small auditorium, her fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the worn leather music folder her grandmother had given her years ago. The autumn fundraiser was in full swing, and the room buzzed with the chatter of neighbors and local business owners who had gathered to support the neighborhood youth programs. She had volunteered to play during the intermission, a decision she was now questioning as her heart hammered against her ribs. At 52 years old, Maria had spent most of her adult life as a hospital administrator, managing schedules and budgets with quiet efficiency. Music had always been her private sanctuary, something she practiced alone in her modest apartment after long shifts, her fingers finding solace on the keys of her old upright piano. She had never performed publicly, never shared this intimate part of herself with anyone beyond her late grandmother, who had been her only teacher and greatest champion. The evening had started smoothly enough. Maria had arrived early, helping to arrange chairs and set up the refreshment table with the other volunteers. She had chosen a simple navy dress for the occasion, nothing that would draw attention, and had pulled her graying hair back into a practical bun. When the event coordinator, a well-meaning woman named Patricia, introduced the evening's performers, Maria felt her stomach tight. There would be several musical acts, she learned, including a young violin prodigy from the local high school and a jazz quartet made up of retired music teachers. As Maria waited backstage in the small preparation area, she overheard two members of the organizing committee talking in hushed voices just beyond the curtain. They clearly didn't realize she was there. One of them, a man whose voice she recognized as belonging to the committee chairman, sounded skeptical. He questioned why Patricia had allowed someone with no performance background to take up valuable program time. The other voice, younger and sharper, laughed quietly and suggested that it was probably just someone who had taken a few lessons as a child and thought they could still play. They agreed it would likely be painful to sit through, but mercifully brief. Maria felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from anger but from a deep, familiar shame that she had carried for decades. She had never been the talented one, never the person others noticed or celebrated. Her older sister had been the academic star, her younger brother the charismatic athlete. Maria had been the responsible middle child, the one who kept things running smoothly, who made sure everyone else had what they needed. Even her grandmother, despite her encouragement, had always spoken of Maria's playing as something lovely for her own enjoyment, never suggesting she was truly gifted. The violin prodigy finished her piece to thunderous applause, and Maria watched from the wings as the teenager took her bows with practiced grace. The girl's parents rushed forward with flowers, their faces glowing with pride. Maria thought of her own parents, both gone now, and wondered if they would have been proud to see her here, or merely puzzled by this uncharacteristic display of boldness. When Patricia called her name, Maria forced her legs to move forward. The stage lights were brighter than she had anticipated, and she had to blink several times as she made her way to the piano, an elegant black grand that the community center had recently acquired through a donation. She heard scattered, polite applause, the kind audiences offer out of courtesy rather than enthusiasm. As she settled onto the bench and adjusted its height, she caught sight of faces in the front rows. Some people were checking their phones, others were whispering to their companions. A few wore expressions of mild curiosity mixed with the weary patience of those prepared to endure something tedious. Maria opened her folder and placed the sheet music on the stand, though she didn't really need it. She had been playing this piece for 30 years, ever since her grandmother had first taught it to her during a difficult period in her life. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, a work of breathtaking beauty that had sustained her through her divorce, through her grandmother's death, through countless lonely evenings when the weight of her ordinary life felt almost too heavy to bear. She positioned her hands over the keys and took a breath, trying to ignore the skeptical energy radiating from the audience. In that moment, she heard her grandmother's voice as clearly as if the old woman were sitting beside her on the bench. Her grandmother had always told her that music wasn't about impressing anyone or proving anything. It was about truth, about opening a door to the deepest parts of yourself and inviting others to witness something genuine and human. Maria closed her eyes briefly, letting the noise of her anxiety fade into the background. When she opened them again, she was no longer in the community center auditorium. She was 13 years old, sitting in her grandmother's living room on a rainy afternoon, learning that the piano could speak feelings she had no words for. She was 28, playing through tears the night her marriage ended, finding in the music a kind of companionship that asked nothing of her. She was 45, saying goodbye to her grandmother, playing this same nocturne at the funeral while rain streamed down the church windows. Her fingers found the first notes, and the opening melody floated into the silence of the hall with a tenderness that seemed to still the air itself. The first notes fell into the auditorium like drops of water into a still pond. each one creating ripples of sound that expanded outward through the hushed space. Maria's fingers moved across the keys with a fluidity that surprised even her. Decades of solitary practice emerging now as something transformed by the presence of witnesses. The melody unfurled with an aching sweetness, each phrase shaped by years of private grief and joy that she had poured into this music when there was no one else to listen. In the audience, the whispering stopped. Phones were lowered. The woman in the third row who had been rifling through her purse froze mid-motion, her hand suspended above her open handbag. The committee chairman who had doubted her sat forward in his seat, his expression shifting from polite tolerance to something closer to astonishment. Even the young violin prodigy, waiting backstage for the final bows, moved closer to the curtain to see who was creating such sound. Maria felt the shift in the room like a physical presence, but she didn't let it distract her. She was deep inside the music now, navigating the nocturne's familiar landscape with the assurance of someone who had walked this path countless times in solitude. Her right hand sang the melody while her left provided the gentle, rocking accompaniment that gave the piece its dreamlike quality. She shaped each phrase with subtle dynamic shadings, allowing the music to breathe and swell and recede like something alive. The nocturne's famous ornamented section arrived, where Chopin's melody becomes increasingly elaborate, decorated with runs and trills that can sound either exquisitely delicate or merely fussy, depending on the player's touch. Maria's grandmother had spent months working with her on this passage, teaching her to make the ornament sound not like technical display, but like the natural outpouring of emotion too large to be contained in simple notes. Now, in the community center, Maria's fingers executed these decorations with a grace that made them seem inevitable, as though the music could not possibly exist in any other form. In the fifth row, an elderly man named Robert felt tears prick his eyes. He had been a piano teacher himself for 40 years before arthritis forced him to retire, and he recognized immediately what he was hearing. This wasn't the playing of someone who had merely learned the notes, someone who had studied technique in a conservatory and emerged with impressive facility but little depth. This was the playing of someone who had lived with this music, who had made it a companion through the long seasons of an ordinary life. The technique was there, solid and reliable, but it served something larger than itself. Maria moved into the middle section of the nocturne, where the melody climbs into a higher register and takes on a more urgent character. Here was where her grandmother had told her to think of longing, of reaching for something beautiful that remained just beyond grasp. Maria thought of all the dreams she had set aside to be practical, to be responsible, to be the person others needed her to be. She thought of the paintings she had never painted, the trips she had never taken, the risks she had never dared. But she also thought of the small, quiet satisfactions of her life. The patients she had helped at the hospital, the colleagues she had mentored, the nieces and nephews she had supported through their struggles. The music swelled and then softened, returning to the opening theme with a sense of bittersweet acceptance. Maria's touch on the keys was tender now, almost whispered, as the nocturne moved toward its conclusion. She allowed each phrase to linger just slightly, not enough to distort the rhythm, but enough to give each moment its full weight. The final measures descended like someone slowly exhaling after holding their breath, the last notes fading into a silence that felt sacred. For several seconds after Maria lifted her hands from the keys, no one moved. The silence stretched and deepened, filling the auditorium with a kind of reverence that rarely graces community center fundraisers. Maria sat motionless at the piano, her hands resting in her lap, uncertain what to do next. She had never experienced this before, this profound quiet that follows music that has truly reached people. Then someone began to clap. It was Robert, the retired piano teacher, rising slowly to his feet. Within seconds, others joined him. The applause built rapidly, spreading through the rows like wildfire, and suddenly the entire audience was standing, their hands coming together in wave after wave of sound. Maria looked up, stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief. People weren't just clapping politely. They were applauding with genuine enthusiasm, some with tears streaming down their faces, others shaking their heads in amazement. Patricia, the event coordinator, stood in the wings with her hand over her mouth, her own eyes damp. The committee chairman who had questioned Maria's inclusion sat heavily back in his chair even as he continued to clap, looking as though he had been struck by something unexpected and humbling. The young violin prodigy watched from backstage with an expression of thoughtful respect, recognizing perhaps that virtuosity takes many forms and doesn't always announce itself with credentials and concert hall appearances. Maria rose from the bench on shaky legs and offered a small, awkward bow. She had never learned how to accept applause, had never imagined she would need to. As she gathered her music folder and turned to leave the stage, several people called out for an encore. The request rippled through the audience, growing louder and more insistent. Maria paused, looking to Patricia for guidance, and the coordinator nodded eagerly, gesturing for her to return to the piano. Her mind raced through her limited repertoire of fully memorized pieces. She settled on something shorter, a Brahms intermezzo that her grandmother had introduced her to in the final year of her life. It was less well known than the Chopin, more introspective and autumnal, but it held a special place in Maria's heart. She returned to the bench and began to play, and once again the audience fell under the spell of her sincere, deeply felt musicianship. When she finished the second piece, the applause was equally warm, though this time Maria managed a more graceful acknowledgement before exiting the stage. As she stepped into the wings, Patricia embraced her, whispering that it was the most beautiful playing she had ever heard in this venue. Other performers waiting backstage offered their congratulations, their words generous and genuine. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. After the final performance, during the reception, Maria found herself surrounded by audience members wanting to speak with her. Robert, the retired teacher, introduced himself and told her that her playing had reminded him why he had devoted his life to music in the first place. A younger woman, perhaps in her 30s, confessed that she had given up piano years ago and was now inspired to return to it. The committee chairman approached, looking somewhat sheepish, and thanked her for her contribution to the evening, adding that it had been the highlight of the entire program. Several people asked if she taught, if she performed regularly where she had studied. Maria answered honestly that she had no formal training beyond what her grandmother had given her, that she had never performed publicly before tonight, that she was just a hospital administrator who played for her own peace of mind. These answers seemed to amaze people even more, as though her lack of professional credentials made her gift more rather than less remarkable. As the evening wound down and Maria helped fold chairs and clear away coffee cups, she felt something shifting inside herself. The voice that had always told her she wasn't special enough, talented enough, worthy enough of attention, had quieted. She understood now what her grandmother had been trying to teach her all those years. The value of what she offered had never been about competing with conservatory graduates or concert pianists. It had been about the honest expression of a human heart speaking to other human hearts through the language of music. Patricia approached as Maria was pulling on her coat, preparing to leave. She asked if Maria would consider playing at future events, perhaps even offering a short recital series at the community center. Maria hesitated, old habits of self-doubt rising reflexively. But then she thought of the faces in the audience, of the tears and the standing ovation, of the way the music had created a moment of genuine connection in a room full of strangers. She agreed, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. They exchanged contact information and made tentative plans to discuss details in the coming weeks. As Maria walked out into the cool autumn night, her music folder tucked under her arm, she felt lighter than she had in years. The street lamps cast pools of golden light on the sidewalk, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint sound of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. She thought of her grandmother, wished she could tell her about this evening, then realized with a small smile that perhaps she already knew. The lessons her grandmother had given her had never really been about piano technique or musical interpretation. They had been about courage, about the importance of offering your gifts to the world regardless of whether those gifts came wrapped in impressive credentials or formal training. Maria reached her car and paused before unlocking it, looking back at the community center where light still spilled from the windows onto the darkened street. In a few days, she would return to her regular routine at the hospital, to schedules and budgets and administrative meetings. But something fundamental had changed. She had discovered that the ordinary life she had always lived contained within it the capacity for extraordinary moments, that the music she had played in solitude for so many years had power and value beyond her small apartment. As she drove home through the quiet streets, Maria made a decision. She would continue to practice, continue to deepen her relationship with the music she loved, but she would no longer hide it away as though it were something too small or insufficient to matter. She would accept Patricia's invitation to perform again. She would say yes to opportunities that her old self would have declined out of fear and self-doubt. The next morning, Maria woke early and went straight to her piano before making coffee or checking her phone. She played through some scales to warm up her fingers, then opened a score she had been working on, a Mozart sonata that she had always found intimidating. The notes that had seemed impossibly difficult just days ago now felt more approachable, as though her hands had gained confidence from being trusted in front of an audience. Later that week, a colleague at the hospital mentioned seeing a post on social media about the fundraiser. Someone had recorded a short video of Maria's performance on their phone and shared it with a caption about discovering hidden talent in unexpected places. The video had been viewed hundreds of times and shared dozens more. Maria felt a flutter of anxiety at this exposure, but also a small thrill of pride. Over the following months, Maria began to build a modest reputation in her community as a pianist of unusual sensitivity and depth. She played at several more fundraisers, at a retirement home where her ability to connect emotionally through music brought comfort to residents with dementia, at a small arts festival where she shared a program with other local musicians. She never quit her job at the hospital, never pursued music as a profession, but she no longer treated her playing as something shameful or insignificant. Robert, the retired piano teacher, became a friend and informal mentor, offering suggestions on new repertoire and occasionally attending her performances. He told her once that in his 4 decades of teaching, he had known many students with more natural facility and more prestigious accomplishments, but few who played with such genuine feeling and honesty. Maria treasured this assessment more than any trophy or award could have meant. The young violin prodigy, whose name was Sarah, sometimes attended Maria's performances as well. After one recital, she approached Maria and said something that struck deep. She explained that watching Maria had taught her that music wasn't ultimately about being the best or the most impressive, but about having something true to say and the courage to say it. For a 17-year-old facing the pressures of competition and college auditions, this lesson had been liberating. 2 years after that first performance at the Autumn fundraiser, Maria stood once again in the community center auditorium, but this time as part of a regular concert series that had grown from Patricia's initial suggestion. The audience had grown too, word having spread about the hospital administrator who played Chopin like someone sharing her soul. As Maria walked onto the stage, she no longer trembled with fear. She felt instead a quiet sense of purpose and belonging. She had chosen her grandmother's favorite piece for this evening, a Schubert impromptu that spoke of both melancholy and hope. As she began to play, she thought of how laughter and doubt had once greeted her presence at this piano, how she had almost let that judgment silence her before she had even begun. She thought of all the people over these past 2 years who had told her that her music had moved them, helped them, reminded them of something important they had forgotten. The music filled the hall with its bittersweet beauty, and Maria understood finally that her grandmother's greatest gift had not been piano lessons at all. It had been the teaching that our deepest offerings to the world need not arrive with fanfare or credentials, that the quiet cultivation of something we love can bloom into unexpected significance, that it is never too late to share the parts of ourselves we have kept hidden, and that sometimes the act of being authentically and vulnerably ourselves is the most powerful performance of all. The morning after Maria's 2-year anniversary concert, she arrived at the hospital to find a small crowd gathered near the administrative offices. Her assistant, Jennifer, hurried over with an excited expression and explained that a local television station had called asking for an interview. A producer had seen the videos of Maria's performances online and wanted to feature her story on their weekly human interest segment. Maria felt her stomach tighten with the old familiar anxiety, but she also felt something new, a curiosity about where this path might lead. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and Maria spent the intervening days trying not to overthink it. She continued her regular routine, reviewing hospital budgets during the day and practicing piano in the evenings. When the production crew arrived at her apartment with their cameras and lights, she felt surprisingly calm. The interviewer, a warm woman named Catherine, asked thoughtful questions about Maria's musical journey, about her grandmother's influence, about what it felt like to discover a public voice for something she had kept private for so long. Maria answered honestly, without trying to make her story sound more dramatic or impressive than it was. She explained that she had never been the talented one in her family, never the person anyone expected great things from. She talked about the overheard conversation at that first fundraiser, about the shame she had felt, and about the decision to play anyway despite knowing that people doubted her. Catherine listened intently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that drew out details Maria hadn't planned to share. When the segment aired 2 weeks later, Maria watched it alone in her living room with a cup of tea. She barely recognized herself on screen. The cameras had captured something in her face when she talked about music that she had never seen before, a kind of quiet radiance that made her look younger and more vibrant than she felt in daily life. The footage of her playing, recorded at the community center, showed an intensity of focus and emotion that surprised her. Was this really how she appeared to others when she performed? The response to the television segment exceeded anything Maria could have imagined. Her phone began ringing within hours of the broadcast, with calls from community organizations requesting performances, from adult students wanting lessons, from a regional arts council asking if she would participate in an outreach program bringing music to underserved schools. The hospital's public relations department fielded dozens of inquiries from patients and staff members who wanted to tell Maria how much her story had inspired them. One call in particular stood out. It came from a woman named Grace, who explained through tears that she was 68 years old and had always dreamed of learning piano but had convinced herself she was too old. Watching Maria's story had given her the courage to finally sign up for lessons. She wanted to thank Maria personally for showing her that it was never too late to pursue something that brought joy. Maria found herself crying too as they talked, overwhelmed by the realization that her small act of courage had created ripples extending far beyond anything she had intended. The director of a music conservatory 2 hours away contacted Maria with an unusual proposition. They wanted to create a special program for adult amateur musicians, people who had significant musical ability but had never pursued professional training. Would Maria be willing to serve as a guest artist for the inaugural session, sharing her story and performing? The director explained that too many talented people gave up music because they believed that without early professional training, their playing had no value. Maria's example, he said, challenged that assumption in a powerful way. Maria accepted the invitation, though it required taking time off work and confronting new levels of self-doubt. The conservatory intimidated her with its grand halls and accomplished faculty. When she arrived for the program, she met 15 other amateur musicians ranging in age from 30 to 75. There was a retired engineer who played cello, a pharmacist who sang opera, a mechanic who composed jazz on saxophone, a librarian who performed Baroque flute. Each had a story similar to Maria's, of passion pursued in private and talent developed in the margins of busy lives. During the 3-day intensive, Maria performed and spoke about her journey. But she also listened to the others share their experiences, and in their stories she heard echoes of her own struggles with self-worth and belonging. Many of them had been told, implicitly or explicitly, that music was frivolous, that it was something to set aside in favor of practical concerns, that amateur meant inferior. Yet here they all were, having created beauty and meaning through their dedication to an art they loved. On the final evening of the program, there was an informal concert where participants could perform for each other. Maria played her grandmother's favorite Schubert impromptu, but this time the experience felt different. She was no longer playing to prove anything or to overcome doubt. She was playing as part of a community of people who understood what music meant when it wasn't your profession, but was nevertheless essential to who you were. The applause that followed came from people who recognized themselves in her playing, and that recognition created a bond deeper than admiration. The retired engineer, a man named Thomas, approached Maria after the concert and told her something that would stay with her for years. He said that professional musicians played with skill that inspired awe, but amateur musicians like themselves played with a quality that was equally valuable, a sense of hard-won joy and persistence that spoke to the human experience of pursuing beauty despite obstacles. Their music, he suggested, had a different kind of authority, one born from choosing to create art while also managing all the demands and disappointments of ordinary life. When Maria returned home from the conservatory program, she found her perspective on her own life fundamentally altered. She had spent so many years seeing herself as unremarkable, as someone who simply helped things run smoothly while others accomplished impressive feats. Now she understood that there was courage and value in the path she had walked. The music she had cultivated in solitude, the skills she had developed without fanfare or recognition, the emotional depth she had poured into her playing during difficult times, all of this had created something genuine and meaningful. The hospital where Maria worked began to see her differently as well. Her supervisor suggested that she might organize some small concerts in the hospital's chapel or waiting areas, providing comfort to patients and families during stressful times. Maria agreed, and soon she was playing short programs once a month in various parts of the hospital. She discovered that music had unique power in that environment, offering solace that words and medical interventions could not provide. Families waiting for news about loved ones in surgery found temporary peace in her gentle playing. Patients recovering from procedures asked for specific pieces that held personal meaning. One afternoon, Maria was playing in the oncology wing when an elderly patient named Dorothy asked if she knew any Chopin. Maria smiled and began the nocturne in E-flat major, the piece that had launched her unexpected journey into public performance. As she played, she noticed Dorothy's breathing slow and her tense shoulders relax. After the music ended, Dorothy opened her eyes and said that her late husband had loved that nocturne, that hearing it made her feel close to him again. Maria sat with Dorothy for a while afterward, and they talked about music and memory and the people they had lost. These hospital performances became some of Maria's most cherished musical experiences. They lacked the formal atmosphere of concert halls and the polish of professional events, but they felt more essential somehow, more connected to the reasons music mattered in human life. She wasn't playing to impress anyone or to demonstrate technique. She was playing to ease suffering, to create moments of beauty in places shadowed by pain and fear, to remind people that even in difficult circumstances, there was still grace and tenderness in the world. Sarah, the young violin prodigy Maria had first encountered at that initial fundraiser, graduated from high school and earned a scholarship to a prestigious music school. Before leaving for college, she invited Maria to coffee and told her that their brief interaction years ago had changed her relationship with music. She had stopped trying to be perfect and had started trying to be honest in her playing. That shift, she said, had made her both a better musician and a happier person. Maria felt humbled by this confession, amazed that her influence had reached someone so talented and accomplished. 3 years after that first performance, Maria received an email from a documentary filmmaker named Marcus, who was creating a film about amateur musicians and the role of art in everyday life. He had seen her television interview and wanted to include her story in his project. Maria hesitated, uncomfortable with the growing attention her musical journey had attracted. She had never sought recognition and still struggled sometimes with feeling like a fraud, like someone who had stumbled into a claim she didn't deserve. She called Robert, her mentor and friend, to discuss her uncertainty. Robert listened patiently as she voiced her doubts, then said something that cut through her confusion. He reminded her that her story wasn't ultimately about her own success or achievement. It was about what happens when ordinary people have the courage to share their gifts despite fear and self-doubt. By allowing her journey to be documented and shared, she wasn't feeding her ego, but rather offering encouragement to countless others who needed permission to pursue their own creative longings. Maria agreed to participate in the documentary. The filming process took several months and involved Marcus and his small crew documenting her daily life, her practice sessions, her hospital performances, and a special recital she gave at the community center. They also interviewed people whose lives had been touched by her music, including Grace, the 68-year-old woman who had finally started piano lessons, and Dorothy's daughter, who spoke about the comfort Maria's playing had brought her mother in her final weeks. Watching the rough cut of the documentary, Maria was struck by how Marcus had woven together all these threads into a narrative about courage, persistence, and the democratization of artistic expression. The film argued that culture's obsession with prodigies and professional excellence had created a world where most people felt they had no right to make art, that unless you were the best, your creative efforts were worthless. Maria's story, along with those of other amateur musicians featured in the film, challenged that premise. The documentary premiered at a small film festival and won an Audience Choice Award. It was subsequently picked up by a streaming service and released to a wider audience. Maria's inbox filled with messages from people around the world sharing their own stories of creative passion pursued in private, of talents they had hidden, of dreams they had abandoned because they didn't seem impressive enough. Many of them thanked Maria for giving them courage to try again, to share what they loved regardless of whether they would ever be professionals. Among the messages was one from a music teacher in Japan who had shown the documentary to her students, hoping to teach them that musical value wasn't only measured in competition victories and conservatory acceptances. Another came from a hospice worker in Australia who had started playing guitar again after a 20-year hiatus, inspired by Maria's example. A father in Brazil wrote that he had been practicing violin in secret for years, too embarrassed to let his family hear him. But after watching Maria's story, he had finally played for them and discovered they loved hearing him despite his imperfections. Maria read these messages late at night, after finishing her hospital work and her evening practice, and felt overwhelmed by the strange turn her life had taken. She had only wanted to honor her grandmother's memory and perhaps overcome her own fear. She had never imagined that her small act of bravery would inspire others or challenge cultural assumptions about who had the right to make music. Yet here she was, accidentally become an advocate for amateur artistry and a symbol of midlife courage. On her 56th birthday, Maria gave a special concert at the community center that had been the site of her first public performance. The hall was packed with people who had followed her journey over the past 4 years, along with newcomers who had discovered her through the documentary. As Maria walked onto the stage, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the circuitous path that had led her to this moment. She thought of her younger self practicing alone in her apartment, never dreaming that anyone would want to hear her play. She thought of her grandmother, whose patient teaching had given her not just musical skills but a foundation of love and encouragement that had sustained her through decades of doubt. She thought of that autumn evening when she had overheard people laughing at the idea of her performing, and how close she had come to walking away. Maria sat at the piano and looked out at the audience. She saw familiar faces, Robert and Patricia and Sarah home from college, colleagues from the hospital, students she had begun teaching, strangers whose lives had somehow intersected with hers through music. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play. And as the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne filled the hall, she understood that this was what her grandmother had always known, that music was never really about talent or credentials or impressing anyone. It was about connection and courage and the willingness to offer something true from your heart to the hearts of others. And in that offering, to discover that you had always been enough. The years that followed Maria's birthday concert brought changes she could never have anticipated when she first sat nervously at that piano 4 years earlier. The documentary continued to find new audiences, particularly among people navigating midlife transitions and questioning whether their unfulfilled dreams still held validity. Maria found herself invited to speak at conferences about creativity and aging, at educational symposiums about the value of amateur arts, at corporate events, where executives sought inspiration about reinvention and authenticity. These speaking engagements felt strange at first. Maria had spent her entire adult life working behind the scenes, facilitating other people's success, and the idea of positioning herself as someone with wisdom to share made her deeply uncomfortable. But she gradually learned to reframe these opportunities not as self-promotion, but as advocacy for all the people who had been told, as she had been told, that their creative efforts didn't matter unless they reached professional standards. At a conference in Seattle, Maria met a neuroscientist named Dr. Amanda Reeves, who had been studying the effects of musical practice on adult brain plasticity. Dr. Reeves approached Maria after her talk and explained that her research showed significant cognitive and emotional benefits from engaging with music as an adult, even without professional aspirations. She asked if Maria would be willing to participate in a study examining the neurological patterns of dedicated amateur musicians. Maria agreed, curious about what science might reveal about the practice that had sustained her through so many difficult years. The study involved brain imaging while Maria played piano and during rest periods. The results fascinated Dr. Reeves. Maria's brain showed activation patterns typically associated with both high-level musical processing and deep emotional engagement. The scientist explained that professional musicians often showed strong technical activation, but sometimes reduced emotional response, perhaps from years of treating music as work. Amateur musicians like Maria, who maintained the passion and emotional connection that had drawn them to music initially, showed different patterns that suggested a unique kind of cognitive engagement. Dr. Reeves published her findings in a neuroscience journal, and Maria's brain scans became part of a growing body of research validating amateur artistic practice. The study caught the attention of educational policymakers who were reconsidering how schools approached arts education. If the benefits of musical engagement came not from professional achievement, but from sustained, passionate practice, perhaps the goal of arts education should shift from identifying and training the talented few to encouraging lifelong creative engagement for everyone. Maria was invited to testify before a state education committee considering funding for school music programs. She found herself in the unfamiliar territory of a legislative hearing room, speaking to policymakers about why music education mattered even for students who would never become professional musicians. She talked about her own experience, about her grandmother's teaching, about the hospital patients who found comfort in her playing, about the messages she received from people who had rekindled their creative lives after watching her story. One legislator, a stern-looking woman who had remained expressionless throughout most of the hearing, raised her hand during the question period. She told the room that she had played clarinet in high school but had given it up when she went to college, believing she wasn't good enough to continue. She was now 62 years old and hadn't touched an instrument in over 40 years. Maria's testimony, she said with unexpected emotion in her voice, had made her wonder what her life might have been like if someone had told her that playing music for personal fulfillment was just as valid as playing for professional achievement. The committee ultimately voted to preserve and expand funding for school music programs, with new emphasis on fostering lifelong engagement rather than solely developing professional track musicians. Maria received a formal letter of thanks from the education department, but more meaningful to her were the messages from music teachers across the state who said the policy shift would allow them to teach in ways they had always believed were important, but hadn't been supported by the system. Back at the hospital, Maria's dual identity as administrator and musician had created an unexpected synergy. The music therapy department approached her about collaborating on a research project examining the effects of live classical piano music on patient recovery rates and pain management. Maria began playing regular sessions in various hospital units, and the preliminary data suggested measurable benefits. Patients who listened to her live performances required less pain medication and reported better sleep quality than control groups. The hospital administration, recognizing the value of this program, created a new part-time position for Maria as artist in residence. She reduced her administrative hours and spent more time bringing music to patients and families. This shift felt like coming home to something she hadn't known she was searching for. The combination of her healthcare expertise and her musical gifts allowed her to work in ways that honored both aspects of her identity. One afternoon, while playing in the cardiac care unit, Maria noticed a man in his 40s sitting in the waiting area with his head in his hands. After she finished her short program, he approached her with red-rimmed eyes and introduced himself as David. His wife was in surgery and he was terrified. He asked if Maria knew any Brahms, explaining that his wife loved the intermezzos and that hearing them might somehow send her strength even though she was unconscious in the operating room. Maria led David to a quieter area where a piano sat unused in a family consultation room. She played 3 Brahms intermezzos while David sat with his eyes closed, tears running down his face. When she finished, he thanked her and said that for the first time in hours, he had been able to breathe fully. His wife survived the surgery, and weeks later, David returned to the hospital with her to find Maria and thank her properly. His wife, Elizabeth, was still weak, but insisted on coming because she wanted to meet the musician whose playing had, in some mysterious way, accompanied her through her surgery. David had told her about the music, and Elizabeth said she had dreamed of piano music during her operation, feeling wrapped in sound that kept her tethered to life. Stories like this one accumulated over the months and years, creating a body of evidence that music's power went beyond entertainment or aesthetic pleasure. Maria kept a private journal where she recorded these encounters, not for publication, but for her own understanding of what was happening through her playing. She wrote about the teenager with anxiety who calmed during her performances, about the elderly man with Alzheimer's who recognized a Chopin waltz and suddenly spoke clearly for the first time in weeks, about the exhausted nurse who sat down during her break and cried while listening to a Schubert impromptu. On the 5th anniversary of her first performance, the community center organized a special celebration. Maria was asked to play, of course, but the event also featured other amateur musicians who had been inspired by her example to share their own gifts publicly. There was a retired accountant who played Celtic harp, a postal worker who sang art songs, a dentist who performed ragtime piano, a social worker who played classical guitar. Together, they created an evening that celebrated not virtuosity but authenticity, not perfection but courage. Patricia, who had first invited Maria to play all those years ago, spoke at the event about the ripple effects of that single decision. She had recently retired from her position as events coordinator, but she said that Maria's performance remained the proudest moment of her tenure. She had taken a chance on someone unknown and unproven, and that small act of faith had blossomed into something far larger than either of them could have imagined. She encouraged everyone in the audience to look for the hidden gifts in the people around them and to create opportunities for those gifts to be shared. Sarah, now a graduate student at a prestigious conservatory, performed a violin piece and spoke about how Maria's example had fundamentally changed her approach to music. She explained that she had been on track to burn out from the pressure of constant competition and the pursuit of perfection. Watching Maria play with such honesty and emotional depth, without the burden of professional expectations, had shown her a different way to relate to her art. She had learned to balance technical excellence with emotional truth, and this balance had made her both a better musician and a healthier person. Robert, now in his 80s and increasingly frail, attended with his daughter's assistance. Maria played a short Chopin prelude in his honor, choosing one of his favorites. Afterward, she sat with him and he told her something he had never shared before. In his long career as a teacher, he had trained dozens of students who went on to professional success, some achieving significant recognition in the music world. But he considered his friendship with Maria and his small role in her musical journey to be among his most meaningful accomplishments. She had reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place, before the pressures of teaching and the disappointments of students who abandoned their studies. She had shown him that the deepest purpose of musical education wasn't to create professionals, but to help people find a source of beauty and meaning they could carry throughout their lives. As the celebration wound down and Maria helped clean up, as she had after that first performance 5 years earlier, she reflected on the strange architecture of the life she had built. She had never stopped being a hospital administrator. She still managed budgets and attended meetings and dealt with the mundane challenges of healthcare bureaucracy. But she had also become something else, a musician who brought comfort to the suffering, an advocate for amateur artistry, an unexpected symbol of midlife courage and creative persistence. The duality of her existence felt sustainable now in a way it might not have earlier in her life. She no longer felt torn between her practical responsibilities and her artistic longings. Instead, she had woven them together into something integrated and whole. Her work at the hospital gave her stability and purpose, and connected her to the human experiences of illness and healing that deepened her musical expression. Her music gave her joy and meaning, and a way to serve that transcended administrative efficiency. Maria's teaching studio had grown gradually over the years. She accepted only adult students, people who came to piano later in life or who were returning after long absences. She had no interest in training prodigies or preparing students for competitions. Instead, she helped people reconnect with the creative impulses they had buried under years of practical obligations. Her students ranged from their 20s to their 80s, and they came from all walks of life: lawyers and truck drivers, teachers and engineers, parents and retirees. One student, a woman named Helen who was 73 when she began lessons, had never touched a piano before. Her husband had recently died, and she was looking for something to fill the vast silence of her days. Progress was slow and sometimes frustrating, but Helen persisted with a determination that moved Maria. After 2 years of study, Helen played a simple Bach minuet at a small student recital Maria organized. Her playing was tentative and imperfect, but when she finished, she looked up with tears streaming down her face and said that she had never felt prouder of anything in her life. The other students, who understood the courage it took to perform regardless of skill level, gave her a standing ovation. Media requests still came occasionally, though less frequently than in the years immediately following the documentary. A journalist writing a book about second-act careers interviewed Maria. A podcast about creativity and aging featured her story. A local news station did a follow-up piece about the hospital's artist-in-residence program. Maria had learned to handle these requests with more grace, understanding that her visibility served a purpose beyond personal recognition. But the most meaningful recognition came in quieter forms. Former hospital patients who stopped her in the grocery store to say that her music had helped them through difficult times. Students who sent her recordings of themselves playing pieces she had taught them. Messages from strangers on the internet saying that her story had given them courage to pursue long-deferred dreams. These small acknowledgments reminded Maria that influence operated through countless tiny interactions, not just through grand gestures or public acclaim. As Maria approached her 60th birthday, she found herself thinking more about legacy and mortality. Her grandmother had been 67 when she died, and Maria had now outlived her by several years. She wondered what her grandmother would think of everything that had unfolded from those early lessons in her living room. Would she be surprised that her quiet, responsible granddaughter had found a public voice? Or had she always known that Maria's gifts would eventually find their way into the world? Maria decided to commission a scholarship in her grandmother's name for adult amateur musicians who wanted to deepen their studies but lacked financial resources. She partnered with the conservatory that had hosted the program for amateur musicians. And together, they created a fund that would provide lessons, master classes, and performance opportunities for people pursuing music outside professional contexts. The first recipients of the scholarship included a single mother who had always dreamed of studying voice, a factory worker who wanted coaching on his jazz guitar playing, and a retired veteran using piano study to manage PTSD. At the scholarship awards ceremony, Maria spoke about her grandmother's teaching philosophy, how she had emphasized music as a path to self-understanding rather than external achievement. She shared that her grandmother had never pushed her to perform publicly or to pursue music professionally. Instead, she had simply created a space where Maria could explore sound and emotion and discover what music could offer her inner life. That gift, Maria said, had proven more valuable than any professional training could have been, because it had given her a relationship with music that could sustain her through all of life's changes and challenges. The ceremony included a concert featuring the scholarship recipients alongside established amateur musicians from the community. Maria played a piece she had recently learned, Beethoven's Pathétique Sonata, second movement. She had avoided Beethoven for years, finding his music too demanding, but had recently felt ready to tackle this achingly beautiful adagio. As she played, she thought about all the years between that terrified first performance and this moment of relative ease, all the practice and performances and failures and successes that had built her capability and confidence. After the concert, a young woman approached Maria hesitantly. She introduced herself as Lily and explained that she was 19 years old and had just dropped out of a prestigious music conservatory. The pressure to be perfect, to win competitions, to build a professional career had destroyed her love of music. She had come to the ceremony hoping to find a different way to relate to her art, a way that didn't require her to be the best or to make music her livelihood. Could she study with Maria? Maria looked at this young woman and saw her own younger self, though Lily's struggles came from too much pressure rather than too little recognition. She agreed to take Lily as a student, but with conditions. Lily would have to stop thinking about music as a career path and instead approach it as a practice that served her growth and well-being. She would have to let go of perfectionism and comparison. She would have to play for the joy and meaning it brought her, not for external validation. Working with Lily over the following months, Maria discovered new dimensions of her own understanding. Teaching someone to rebuild their relationship with music from a place of burnout and disillusionment required different skills than helping an enthusiastic beginner. Maria drew on her own experience of playing through difficulty, of finding solace in music during her divorce and her grandmother's death, of using practice as meditation and performance as connection. Slowly, Lily began to rediscover why she had loved music in the first place. One evening, after a particularly good lesson where Lily had played Chopin with genuine feeling rather than technical display, the young woman asked Maria if she ever regretted not pursuing music professionally. Maria considered the question carefully before answering. She said that she sometimes wondered what might have been different if she had trained at a conservatory or pursued performance as a career. But she didn't experience those wonderings as regret. The path she had taken, however circuitous and unconventional, had led her to a relationship with music that felt authentic and sustainable. She had avoided the burnout that afflicted many professional musicians. She had maintained the passion and emotional connection that made music meaningful. She had built a life where music served her rather than demanding that she serve it. Lily listened thoughtfully and then said something that surprised Maria. She observed that Maria had actually achieved something remarkable, that she had found a way to be a musician without making music into a career, and in doing so had preserved the very qualities that made her playing so moving. Her lack of professional training hadn't been a limitation, but perhaps a kind of protection, keeping her relationship with music pure and personally meaningful. Maria had never thought of it quite that way before. She had always framed her amateur status as a limitation, something to overcome or at least acknowledge with apologetic humility. But Lily's perspective suggested a different interpretation. Perhaps there was power and value in choosing not to professionalize something you loved, in keeping it as a practice that existed for its own sake, rather than for external recognition or financial survival. As Maria's 60th birthday approached, she planned a special recital that would mark both this milestone and the 6-year anniversary of her first public performance. She chose a program of pieces that had been important to her at different stages of her journey. The Chopin Nocturne that had started everything, the Brahms Intermezzo she had played as an encore that first night, the Schubert Impromptu that reminded her of her grandmother, the Mozart Sonata she had once found too difficult, and the Beethoven Pathétique movement she had recently mastered. The recital sold out quickly, with people traveling from across the state and even from neighboring states to attend. Maria felt a flutter of nerves as the day approached, reminded that despite years of performing, she never entirely lost the anxiety that accompanied public exposure. But the nervousness felt different now, less like fear of judgment and more like the heightened awareness that came with doing something that mattered. The evening of the recital, Maria stood backstage in the same community center where she had first performed, though the space had been renovated and expanded since then. She could hear the audience settling into their seats, the murmur of conversation and shuffling of programs. Patricia came back to wish her luck, as did Robert's daughter, who reported that her father was too ill to attend, but had asked her to tell Maria he was thinking of her. Sarah had sent flowers with a note thanking Maria for showing her what it meant to play with courage and honesty. As Maria walked onto the stage, she experienced a moment of profound clarity. She saw her entire life as a kind of composition, with its unexpected modulations and surprising harmonies, its moments of dissonance that had resolved into beauty, its themes that had repeated and developed and transformed over time. The audience's applause washed over her, and she recognized many faces, but also many she had never seen before. People who had come because they had heard her story and wanted to witness what an ordinary person could achieve through dedication and courage. Maria sat at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. Before beginning to play, she looked out at the audience and spoke briefly. She thanked them for coming and for supporting her unlikely journey. She acknowledged her grandmother, whose teaching had planted seeds that had taken decades to fully bloom. She mentioned the people who had laughed at her piano all those years ago, not with bitterness but with gratitude, because their doubt had forced her to decide what she truly believed about her own worth and her right to share her gifts. Then she began to play, and as the familiar opening measures of the Chopin Nocturne filled the hall, Maria felt herself settle into that place where nothing existed except the music and the deep well of feeling from which it emerged. The years fell away, and she was simultaneously 52 and terrified at her first performance, and 60 and seasoned and sure, and 13 learning these notes from her grandmother, and all the ages in between, all the versions of herself unified in this single act of offering what she had cultivated in solitude to these gathered listeners. The recital lasted 90 minutes, and when Maria played the final notes of the Beethoven, she lifted her hands from the keys and sat in the ringing silence that followed. Then the audience rose to their feet, and the applause came in waves, and Maria stood and bowed, and allowed herself to receive this recognition not as something she had earned through exceptional talent, but as acknowledgement of the courage it takes to show up authentically in the world, to share what you love despite fear and doubt, and to trust that your small offerings matter even when you cannot see their full impact. At the reception afterward, Maria moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and thanks. But the moment that stayed with her came near the end of the evening when a woman in her mid-30s approached. She introduced herself as the daughter of one of the committee members who had doubted Maria before her first performance. Her father had died the previous year, but before his death, he had attended several of Maria's concerts and had told his daughter that Maria's playing had taught him something important about humility and the danger of making assumptions about people's capabilities based on their credentials or lack thereof. He had asked his daughter to tell Maria, if she ever had the chance, that he was sorry for his initial judgment and grateful for what her music had brought to the community. Maria felt tears sting her eyes as she listened to this message from beyond the grave. She thought about the circuitous journey from being laughed at to being celebrated, about how the same person could inspire both reactions, about how persistence and authenticity could gradually shift perception and open hearts that had been closed. She thanked the woman for sharing her father's message and said that she hoped he had understood she had never held his initial doubt against him, that she had been doubtful too, and that courage often began precisely in that place of uncertainty. As Maria drove home that night through quiet streets, she reflected on the strange and beautiful arc of her life. She had never become famous in any conventional sense. She would never play in major concert halls or be reviewed by important critics. She would never make her living as a musician or achieve the kind of recognition that professional success brings. But she had done something perhaps more valuable. She had lived into the fullest expression of her gifts. She had found the courage to share what she loved despite not being the best or the most talented. She had created ripples of inspiration and encouragement that had spread far beyond her small sphere of influence. The piano in her apartment welcomed her home, and although it was late and she had just played for 90 minutes, Maria sat down and played a bit more, not for any audience but for herself. For the pure pleasure of making sound, for the meditation and solace it provided, for the connection it maintained with her grandmother and with all the versions of herself who had ever touched these keys. And in that private playing, in the music that nobody would ever hear, Maria understood that this was where it had all begun and where it would always return, to the simple joy of engaging with beauty, to the profound satisfaction of pursuing something you love, to the quiet knowledge that a life lived authentically, however ordinary it might appear, creates meaning that ripples outward in ways you may never fully comprehend, but that matter nonetheless, deeply and truly, in the intricate web of human connection and inspiration that binds us all together. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.